Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Courageous Leadership Academy Live. If you're new to the channel, my name is Dr. Kelly Waltman. I'm the host of this YouTube channel and this series, and we talk about all things leadership, business ownership, entrepreneurship, just helping you be a better leader in whatever capacity that is for you. And we're really excited to have you joining us for this episode. And also, if you're new here, make sure you hit that bell and subscribe to be notified when we have new content and interviews. And I'm really excited to introduce our guest for today. Her name is Beth Smull. She is a skilled restorative practitioner who has provided direct services to struggling youth and their families. She provides professional development on restorative practices to a worldwide audience of educators, counselors, and social workers, and she's worked with schools across the country to improve school climate. And one of the key restorative practices that she is well versed in is listening circles. And that's really our primary topic today. And I'm really excited for all of us to learn more about this restorative practice. She is also a lecturer in the graduate program at the International Institute for Restorative Practices. And on top of all of that, as if that's not enough, she co-authored a book on the restorative practice of family group decision-making, actually something I've studied quite a bit. And the book's title is Family Power, Engaging and Collaborating with Families. And she is a frequent presenter on restorative practices at numerous state, national, and international conferences. So without further ado, let's bring Beth into the broadcast. Hello.
Hi, how are you?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm great. It's great to be here with you today.
Yeah, thank you so much. Welcome. I'm really excited to talk about this because this is restorative practices are something that are near and dear to my heart, and family group decision making and family involvement. That was my dissertation topic. So I am all about this conversation today. I'm so excited.
Awesome.
So is there anything more that you would like to share in terms of an introduction for yourself before we kind of dive into our questions here?
No, I think I would just, highlight a little bit of the work we're doing at the IIRP graduate school. So I'm involved in both our credit and non-credit offerings. So we do have several non-credit offerings that were all shifted to online about a year ago, and will continue to stay there, as well as our graduate program. So I kind of have the best of both worlds. I have an opportunity to work and train with our non-credit offerings and work on the curriculum, but also teach in the graduate school. So it's been really cool to be able to see both sides of things.
Yeah, that's great. Can you talk to us a little bit more about like all of the services that the IIRP provides?
Yeah,
just to educate people about this amazing institution.
Yeah, thank you. So again, we offer several non-credit offerings from our restorative practices for educators and facilitating restorative conferences. We do have an event on listening circles, which I know is primarily what we're going to speak about today. We've all created some new offerings through COVID. One is an opportunity for school administrators. It's called Putting Theory into Practice. So it's a professional learning community model where we're bringing folks together on a weekly basis. It's 4 weeks long to just be able to learn from one another and how we're navigating, these experiences. We've also recently partnered with Flawless Consulting, and that's a new offering in the non-credit realm. I actually just went through the event last week. It was really interesting and really cool to kind of see, again, the restorative practices and leadership and consulting kind of merging together. So those are some of the highlights from our non-credit offering. We also have a Train the Trainer in our curriculum so that folks can turn this over and train in their own organizations and their own schools. And we have a curriculum that we've been using for many years. So folks can kind of do it as is, right? Or they can adapt and make the changes that fit the needs of their organization and their schools.
That's great.
And then on the credit offerings, we actually have 3 different pathways that folks tend to take. So we do offer a master's certificate, which is 12 credits. So we have a lot of adult learners in that come through our doors, right? Who already have a master's degree, maybe even a PhD, and are not necessarily looking for that, but want to learn more. So the certificate is a great option. We have a 30 credit Master of Science, and then we've recently added a thesis option for folks who do want to go deeper, especially into the research.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I would say check the website. There's a lot of great resources. We have a series of presidential papers that have been coming out, and it's again, you can kind of get lost in some of those things. So I can
Yeah.
share that with you later as well before we're finished.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And I'll make sure in the video description that we include the links to the website so people can find the resources. But that's just helpful to understand more about the IIRP and yeah, really just get a sense of the great work that you're doing. I love that with the learning communities. I mean, I think that's something that was a great practice and really advantageous, certainly pre-COVID. Like
Yeah.
it's a great practice to have. But yeah, especially as you highlighted, as we are, in this last year had such uncertainty, and I hesitate to use the word unprecedented because I know it got used so much, but it really was. And so we all had to learn, we all had to grow and adapt. And so to have that opportunity through a more like formal structure, that's
Yeah.
awesome.
Yeah, they've been really interesting and helpful, to again, just to start to create these online communities. We do have a pretty wide network, worldwide and international. So it's been really great to be able to go online and to connect with folks. And then again, in those learning communities, to have it be an ongoing experience, has really been helpful.
Yeah, very cool.
Yes.
So let's talk about listening circles. And I like to just start at the very beginning, basic level. What are listening circles for
Sure.
everybody wondering, what the heck are we talking about?
Yes. Well, I think I first want to say that, we did not at IIRP invent listening circles. This practice has been happening in so many different forms all through the world in Indigenous communities, really since the dawn of time. So the process that we've connected with most is actually based on a restorative conference, which is a scripted model. And that process comes to us from the Maori people of New Zealand. So that's kind of our entry point into this. But at the very beginning of my experience with this particular, again, scripted process, I believe was the summer of 2018 at this point. Kelly, you may remember being in Pennsylvania. There was a grand jury report that was released that outlined all of the church sexual abuse that had happened here in the diocese outside of Philadelphia. And I grew up in the Catholic Church. I went to Catholic school, and I remember how impacted I was by reading that, right? And being on the phone with family members and friends and just kind of reading through, I wasn't naive enough to think it wasn't happening where I was, but until that moment, it was something that was happening somewhere else, right? And I can remember talking to one of my oldest friends and having a conversation about like, well, what can we do, right? We're restorative practices is about bringing people together in the wake of these instances. So I'd reached out to our president, John Bailey, at the IIRP, and he was already having these conversations, which was really cool.
Amazing. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So there was a small group of folks who were just kind of getting together and talking about different things that we could potentially do and different options. And we had some colleagues in Australia, Vic and Liz O'Callaghan, who've been, again, really involved in restorative practices in schools, who they had a very similar thing happen in Australia. It wasn't called a grand jury report, but it was basically the same thing. And they talked us through how, again, tapping into the restorative conference script and really those traditions of Indigenous communities. It was just an amazing way to apply the ancient wisdom to the experiences and the issues that we were facing in the 21st century.
Right.
So the beauty of this scripted model and what Vic and Liz really imparted to us was that it should be something that the community is doing, right? So it's not, let's bring a team of folks from IIRP and run these circles and be these experts. It was rather, let's train the folks there to run these circles. So that makes it a little different than a restorative conference where you would tend to have someone who wasn't involved in the incident as the facilitator, right? In this experience, the facilitator also is a participant. In the circle. So that's another, a bit of a different piece to it. So we were really fortunate and had a church locally who was willing to give it a shot. So John and I went to their parish council, and we ran a circle for them. And then we did this kind of in several different layers. We first met with the volunteers who wanted to learn how to be facilitators, and we kind of coached them up a little bit. Again, it's scripted. So you're really just kind of reading from the script. There's 2 lead people, who start everything and, kind of get the ball rolling. And then we just break into small circles of no more than 7 people. So you have enough time to really, answer the questions and really get connected in your smaller circle. And then the final piece is the whole group coming together and just talking about themes that came out. And, what were some of the commonalities? So it starts again in a very large group, breaking into a small group, and then back to a large group. So the live event, at the church worked really well, and it was a nice kind of jumping off point for us. And then we started to realize, my gosh, we could apply this to any collected harm, right? That people were experiencing. And again, what makes this difference, it's not about bringing folks who created harm and those who were harmed together. It's not that, right? It's just people who have been harmed through the process, right? Or who are just left in the wake of, of all of these things. We like to think of it almost as a collected harm, right? So designed to really help people process some type of event or issue that poses a challenge to their entire community. So again, it's not, we weren't bringing priests together with, survivors, right? We were just bringing the folks who were showing up every week, who were just really impacted by seeing this and reading this.
Right. That's great. Yeah, because I think, and maybe not everybody watching this will understand the broader lens of restorative practices, but you touch on that in there, that often restorative practices are about bringing, an individual or individuals who caused some harm with the person who was harmed, bringing them together for restoration. So it's really, this is a great nuance to that, where, like you said, you're bringing the community that was harmed, this collective harm, bringing them together that help process. And I love that. I think that that's such a great approach and a way to help people process. And I would imagine it's very healing. I would think that, it helps, it can be cathartic.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so, again, it's pretty simple. It's only about 4 questions. And the first question is just a connector, like, who are you and what brought you here? But we tend to do a past, a present, and a future question. So in that instance, it was, what have you been thinking and feeling since the report came out? What's been the hardest thing for you? And what is something you need to do moving forward? So again, really simple questions that it's just about you. The restoration in this experience is pretty much around self, to some degree. We did have some people show up, who had left the church, who hadn't been there in a long time, who just wanted to talk, right? Wanted to have that opportunity for storytelling, a little bit of, I think, a catharsis to some degree, in those particular instances. And again, the process was meant that the church would continue without us. It's not about, again, these experts coming in, and running this, right? It's about, really us just building capacity in any community to be able to do that. And that's really where we went next after, we had gotten some experience around working with the church.
And so you worked to train the facilitators so that they could continue to do that work after you left. Okay.
Yeah. And then the next step, so that happened early 2019. By the summer of 2019, we had a 1-day training that we wanted to, beta test in a few spots. And we went to Detroit and we went to New London, Connecticut, and just trained community members, from all different sectors. So at this point, we wanted to try to move beyond the collected harm that was just happening there. And again, start to explore and see where else this could work. So in Detroit, our topic was around the school to prison pipeline. In New London, we did a topic that was very specific to their community, something that had happened in one of their schools. But we trained folks from higher ed, from the public schools, from community activists. We even had some teenagers show up at the training too to be trained. So again, that was kind of our next step, was broadening, right, on where we could go.
That's great.
Yeah.
Are there any topics that you won't cover or tackle, or are there any, like kind of parameters or anything that's kind of beyond the scope of what you feel comfortable, doing with a listening circle?
Not yet. I think that you
Answer.
right? To say the least. We got most of our experience in this work in 2020, right, when COVID happened. So it was a process that was very easily adapted to online. So what we did in April of 2020 last year, and this just started with our own staff and students and alumni, was to just give people, again, that space. We're all at home. We're all experiencing this, something that none of us have ever experienced before. Right. What's happening? What's going on? So we changed the questions, right? So then the questions became, what have you been thinking and feeling as COVID continues to unfold? That first question is really the naming it question, right? Like, what are we here to talk about? What are we here to explore? What's the hardest thing for you? That kind of remains the same. And then that future forward question tends to be, again, what's something in your control you can do? What's something important for you to consider? What do you need after today? So something that, again, can build that self-efficacy to make us feel like there is something we can do. Even if it's tomorrow, I'm going to get up and take a walk. That's one thing I can do, in my control. So again, that was really where we started. And from there, in May and June, we opened up to the public. We did just several listening circles after the murder of George Floyd. And again, questions changed at that point. So it became, what have you been thinking since the murder of George Floyd and countless others who've had their lives taken, right? What's the hardest thing for you? And what's, again, the most important thing for you to do moving forward? What do you need? So that started to evolve, right? And, and move from there. And then as we move into the fall, we did create a training, and the training is in 2 parts, so that the first day you experience a listening circle and you learn the nuts and bolts, and then you have 2 weeks to practice, whether it's with your friends or your family or at your workplace or in your community. And then you come back 2 weeks later and we talk about how it went, and we do a little, kind of coaching you up and answering questions. So into the fall, we did around elections, right? We did, okay. The one I did was around political unrest. And it just so happens that the listening circle was on January 13th. So we were a week after the Capitol and a week before the inauguration on the day of the impeachment. It actually happened while we were in the event. So we're like, this was probably pretty good timing. But again, the really interesting thing about this first question and really naming it is it shouldn't happen in isolation. Like, there really should be a group of people who are really thinking this through. Like, what do we want to ask? How do we want to name it? And how do we keep it fairly broad? So my co-facilitator and I, for the political unrest, we had our questions set, and then January 6th happened. So we sat together again and said, well, should we change the question? Should we focus it on January 6th? But then we weren't sure who was showing up. And we had some folks who weren't from the U.S.
Oh, wow.
We didn't want to make it so specific to the U.S. when we had folks from Europe and folks from the islands and from Canada that may or may not be impacted by what's happening.
Well, there's a lot of political unrest globally, and what's happening in other countries also affects how you're feeling in your own country. So yeah, that's a great point. Yeah.
So we decided to just stick with the original questions, which was, what have you been thinking as we live in a more increasingly divided world?
Yeah.
Right? It wasn't specific to the U.S. So then if I am living in the U.S., I'll speak to that. If I'm from the U.K., I'll speak to that. If I'm from Barbados, I'll speak to that. So, we decided, not to do it. And then we debriefed it, though, with the group and said, this was kind of some of that meta conversation of, how we came up with these questions and, and what we wanted to do. So from there, we've done, we had 2 facilitators who did one specifically for women in COVID, what that experience is like, juggling home and kids and homeschooling and work and all of those. And it wasn't just women who came to that, but that was the topic. I've run one around police and community relationships. Has been another topic. One of my friends and colleagues, when we come together and talk about, well, what's next, right? What will we?
Right.
She always says the world is going to tell us what's next.
I was going to say, don't ask that, because you.
Yeah.
There's, yeah, and that's absolutely right. But it is amazing to think that how much, fodder you've had for conversation over the last year, just, not to put it lightly like that, but it's true. I mean, just, it's been one thing after the other. It's been such a tumultuous year, from, yes, global pandemic to social justice issues to political, so yeah, I think you'll probably be able to continue to debrief that for a while. And yeah, the world will certainly bring something new to the forefront. Yeah.
And again, depending on where you are, I mean, I have a lot of, because I've been so fortunate and done a lot of training, throughout the country and even the world, we've gotten a lot of, inquiries. Because once you have the script, you can do whatever you want, really. You can kind of insert questions. So when the fires were happening out west last summer and fall, I was getting a lot of inquiries around that. So we talked about crafting the questions, specifically for that. I mean, there's things we haven't talked about, right, that we certainly could, put into to the model. So I don't know that anything is off limits. We try to be really balanced, though, about who's facilitating these, right?
Right.
So we don't want to have two white women running the circle around race.
Right.
We don't want to have two men running the circle around COVID and women.
Right.
We want to have a balance, right, of age and gender and experience even. So that's another really important layer, I think, to this is, who's running it, who's facilitating, and how can we really create that brave space for folks to feel comfortable.
That's great. Yeah. And I'm curious, have you had the dynamic where, you're getting these varied perspectives and divergent perspectives, and how does that mesh then in the conversation? How does that play out?
Yeah. I would say for the most part, most folks who are coming to these are opting in, right? So I would say there's not, I have not experienced any major conflict, right? I mean, people I think may be on different pages or have different thoughts, but I have experienced a shift in thinking, whether that's been my own or someone else's, right? So one example of that was the first one we did with the church. There was, I remember in the facilitator training, folks were like, well, is this really, like, not downplaying it, but almost like this happened like 50 years ago. Like, where's the line, right? When do we move on? And then we ended up there were a couple survivors who came to that event, who were well into their, 70s and 80s. And that shifted it for folks. Like, okay, now I get why it matters 50 years later, because people are still walking around with this, and really need that experience. Or, or again, even the ones around George Floyd and race, and we've continued to do that listening circle, but in different questions and different versions, and it's very much designed to be consciousness raising, I would say, more than anything else. So I wouldn't put that in the anti-racist work necessarily, but I think it's a first step to get there. So you're hearing from perspectives that you may not hear from, in whatever. I'll speak for me, what I wasn't hearing in my little bubble, right? Really important for me to push beyond that. So consciousness raising was so important, right? Or hearing different perspectives that I hadn't considered. And when a colleague of mine and I started to work together to create questions around the community and police relationships, he was very helpful. And again, raising my consciousness and awareness for someone who grew up in a fairly middle-class white neighborhood who didn't have a lot of experience with police, and him as a Black man living in Detroit, completely different perspective, right? So it was really, again, eye-opening to just develop the questions together,
right?
What we were going to ask, which is, again, I can't stress enough that you should not be developing these in isolation in a room, but just going back and forth and having a lot of different perspective has been helpful.
Yeah. Yeah, I can imagine that. I mean, one of the things I want to ask you is about the, kind of the benefits, but I can just, in hearing you describe this, I can imagine that not only just putting, like naming, as you said, naming the feeling, naming the experience, putting that into words and sharing that out loud has to be such an amazing experience for people. But yes, the benefit of dialogue and hearing different perspectives, and because we are in, as I call it, like this echo chamber so often. So to be able to break out of that and to hear these other perspectives and have that healthy dialogue about, well, this is my perspective, this is my story, but then also hearing somebody else's. And even if at the end you're not going to agree, to at least have heard that other experience and expand your view, that in and of itself, I think would be worth the entire experience.
Yeah, yeah. And again, because it's scripted, it stays very structured.
Yeah.
So the facilitator will read, we call it a preamble. It's what it's called in a restorative conference too, right? And it's, we're not here to debate. We're not here to dialogue. We're here to listen. We go through agreements. We offer to the group to add agreements. But we try to keep as much structure in place so that it really just does force you to listen.
Right.
And not to listen and not to respond, right? So the beginning part, we start with an Indigenous acknowledgement. We start with a mindful moment, to just kind of get us grounded in our space and kind of preparing ourselves, because it's not often that we just sit and take it in and only answer from our perspective.
Right.
So even if you're not necessarily agreeing or it's not quite landing right, it may be something you go back to the next day, or like, oh, that was really, interesting. So again, everyone has voice. It really does give this opportunity for cultivating empathy. We talk about a brave space as opposed to a safe space of, again, people, courageous enough to be able to share the impact with the community. Sometimes, again, it can begin a healing process. And the cool thing about when we've done these in intact communities. So again, in the example of the church, you can take next steps, right? You can talk about, what do we want to do next? What's the next, how do we want to rally? How do we want to, work together as a community to do some real concrete moving forward and problem solving? Whereas the ones we've done that have just kind of been open to whomever shows up, where we'll never be in that space again together, it becomes more about the individual and what's important for me to do.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Moving forward. So there is a difference between an intact group versus a group that only will come together one time in this experience.
Right. Yeah. So are there other benefits that you've seen that, and maybe you've gotten feedback from people about their experiences? What's some of the feedback you've received?
Yeah, a lot of it has just been, I couldn't believe how good I felt afterwards, of just being able to get it out. A lot, again, of that consciousness raising and hearing a different perspective that you hadn't considered before. In the beginning part, where we're all together in a large group, the two lead facilitators answer the questions first as a way to model, but also to give folks something to potentially respond to. So people have said that, like, well, after hearing so-and-so answer, I was able to, help formulate what I was thinking about it, or, really, shifting. As I mentioned, we did we had about 6, I think, on COVID in April and May of last year for students, alumni, and then we ended up opening it up to some of our trainers. There were people who came like 3 or 4 times, and every time they answered the question, it was different. And, every time they, had that experience, it was a little bit different. I most recently did one with a school who was just returning to online or to in-person learning. So it was similar to those COVID questions, but that, instead of as what have you been thinking and feeling as the pandemic unfolds, it's what have you been thinking and feeling as you come back to in-person.
Right.
And that was just really huge for them because they hadn't talked about it.
Right.
Like, okay, here we go. Let's do it. starting, next week, you're going to be back in hybrid or in class or, whatever. But they just never had the space to just say, I'm relieved or I'm freaked out or,
Right.
uh,
Both.
right?
Yeah.
So, I don't know that we always give ourselves the space to really
Mhm.
do that. And again, in this pretty structured way, like I can vent to my friends or my family and, let off steam, but then they're sometimes giving me advice or, it's about relating. And this is not that, this just is, we say as we go into the, at the end of the mindful moment, you have an opportunity to, a responsibility to listen and an opportunity to be heard.
Oh, that's beautiful.
And,
I love that.
yeah, and I can't take credit for that. That came from my colleague, Mary Jo. But it really does just name it.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Um, well, and I love too that you've mentioned a couple times that you ask one of the questions. I'm going to mess it up probably and won't get it exactly right. But what's something that I can do? Like what's something I can control? And I think there's great power in that, especially when you're tackling these very heavy topics that can feel so out of your control and so overwhelming. So to help people think through what's one small thing I can do that's within my control,
yeah,
that's got to be really, really
yeah,
powerful for
yeah,
people.
yeah, yeah. I
Yeah.
think so. I mean, again, we always try to format those questions in the past, present, and future, right? Where were we? What are we? Where are we going? Uh,
Right.
Always landing in that moving forward space.
Yeah.
Whether it's what can I do? What do I want to know more about? What do I need, moving forward? What's important for me, moving forward? But I believe it really does, kind of tap into and just reinforce that self-efficacy of
Yeah.
there is something, right? I can do something. It doesn't have to be huge. I can't fix it. I can't make the pandemic go away. I can't, make the election not happen.
Right.
But I can choose to do some things, right? I can choose to get up at the same time every day and create a routine. I can, choose to take a break every afternoon for 15 minutes and make a cup of tea. I can choose to take a walk, at lunchtime and just get out of my head. Um,
Right.
and I think there is some power in that.
Yeah. Are there lessons from, the circle practice that we can apply to just be better listeners more broadly, like just kind of things like takeaways that we can implement?
I think so. Yeah, we do in the training. We do some activities around listening. Of just one of them is and it is, some folks who are listening may have done something similar, where we just get into pairs and we have someone share something they're proud of, and then it's the listener's job to just reflect back, what did you hear? Right. So, yeah. And again, that's not, a new activity, but I did that recently with a group. We had like a small, like interactive webinar,
Mhm.
and they wanted to focus on listening. So we talked about the competency of listening. Microsoft Education has taken some competencies that originated from Lominger, which is kind of from the business world, and listening is one of the competencies. So we talk about what is the basic level all the way through experts. But even just in that dyad, and someone came back and said, I've done this activity probably like 10 times over my career, but it's just a good reminder, to
Right.
just sit and listen, right? And to just be able to repeat back. Or we'll do an activity around just what are the barriers? What gets in the way of listening?
Mm.
And kind of brainstorm that, in the training as well, because I think that is something that we can use everywhere, right? Not just in this process.
Yeah,
Uh,
for sure.
yeah, and then when we get to the barriers, it's not like we can necessarily remove them completely, right? So if fear is a barrier or bias is a barrier, some of those things we're always going to have with us, right? But how do we decrease them? How do we, try to detour them a little bit better? If we know that the bias is there, we know that I know I'm closed-minded about this one particular thing, which becomes a barrier to how I hear. What's a strategy I can use, right? So we unpack that, in the training. So a lot of those listening activities that we do have a lot more of a broader application outside of just the circle.
That's great. Yeah, that activity you mentioned at the very beginning there is really powerful because so often we're listening to respond, not actually listening to just understand and to truly hear what the other person is saying. We're listening with, okay, what am I going to say next? Or, oh, that made me think of this. And it's hard to break out of that cycle. So when you're forced to really just listen and then reflect back, that is really helpful activity and exercise. Yeah.
Yeah, it's fun. It's definitely it's a good reminder. It's a good practice. So
Yes. Yeah, definitely.
Yep.
Yeah. Are there any other, I know you talked about some of the experiences. Are there any other kind of key stories from some of the listening circles you've done that you can share, without violating any kind of like confidentiality or anything, but any other, I don't know, I don't necessarily want to say the word transformation, that might be too much, but like, is there, I don't know, are there like key stories that you can share?
Well, I think a theme, if it, maybe not a story, but a theme that seems to come across and again, in the final part where we all come back together after these small groups have been in the listening circles, and we'll share out those themes, and often it's through the chat. But almost every time, there's 5 or 6 different groups are reporting out very similar things, right? So it's almost this, again, like, oh, it's not just me. I'm not isolated, right? There is this common humanity that we all have, that we're all experiencing. So I think that's one of the, and again, I don't know if it's, I think for some it might be transformational, but it's more of just I'm not alone in this, right? It's not just me who's experiencing this. Or again, the one around political unrest, because we had folks from outside of the US, that was really powerful, because we were able to talk about, and folks were able to hear what's happening in different countries, and what other folks are experiencing. So it kind of, again, gets you out of that bubble or that echo chamber of, just what you're used to. So that's been really helpful. And even the ones we did last summer around specifically to in response to the murder of George Floyd, again, we had folks from different countries who were hearing the American perspective and just had so much empathy and just learned a lot. I would say that would probably be something that I found to be pretty transformational, of just hearing, again, things that I would not have thought of or experienced in living in my bubble or my echo chamber. It certainly pushed my my thinking and my consciousness, for sure.
Yeah, that's amazing. I love that you're getting people from all over, literally all over the world. That's really fantastic.
Yeah.
People are finding it and engaging.
Yeah. And folks are taking this and running with it too, right? So, again, even our training is not meant to continue to come back to us, right? It's, here's everything, create your own team now, right? How will you turn this over? How will you, train other folks? And we have some colleagues in Singapore that have been they started with us back with a year ago when we were doing things around COVID.
Okay.
And they had some community-based organizations, so we're running them with families and young people. And the IIRP also has model programs in Southeastern Pennsylvania, Community Service Foundation and Bucksmont Academy, which, private academic, high schools, foster care, drug and alcohol, outpatient. They started running the listening circles again back in April for their families. And the communities. And because it was just a very adaptable process to online and to Zoom, could do breakout rooms. That's another interesting thing I just thought of when I did like a training, a facilitator training for the CSF Bucksmont folks. And this was, again, would have been back in like last April. And when we went into the breakouts for the actual listening circle, I didn't give them a lot of time, because in my head, I'm like, oh my gosh, they know how to do this. They know how to run circles. This is just like a quick answer the questions. And when they came back, I think I gave them a half an hour, and I probably should have given them 45 minutes is what we would have done. And when everyone came back, they're like, we're only on the second question. It's like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. So we come back to their breakout rooms. And when they came back, it was that for the last like month or 4 to 6 weeks, we've been taking care of or focusing on everything else.
Right.
We never had an opportunity again to just talk about what was happening for us. It's the same as the one I did at the school not that long ago as they're transitioning back to in person. So I think sometimes we forget too, as the helper role. We don't always answer these questions. So I'm like, oh, this will just be easy. They'll just do quick, 4 rounds and they'll be done. And they're like, oh no, we're not done yet.
We have a lot to process here.
before we're done. So.
Yeah. So are there, speaking of, training people and training teams and, taking and running with it, do you see this as being applicable really across the board for businesses, schools, churches, community groups? Like, can really kind of any, and I know you talked about the difference between intact community versus not, but is this really something that really any intact community could pursue and benefit from?
Absolutely. And that's what we've seen come through the training so far, right? It has been community leaders, folks from churches, nonprofit organizations. CSF Bucksmont also offered listening circles to their referral sources, back over the summer, as again, that self-care piece of just giving the adults some space to talk about it. I participated in a workshop at JCJC around listening circles, again, for probation officers, right? And, folks to kind of talk through what they've been experiencing. So yes, again, we've seen that, coming through the trainings. I think as far as leadership in workplaces, we talk about that a lot in restorative practices, workplace culture. These things impact us, right? So sometimes it's hard to get back to work when, all of these things are happening around us. So we ran some of these just with our own staff and organization to just give space to it, so that you can kind of get back and, and do the work that you're there to do. But, we ran them with our staff last summer, again, in response to the murder of George Floyd. We had pre and post election circles, for folks to, just kind of get just to be able to, and all voluntary, none of this is, I should have said that from the beginning. None of this is mandatory. This is all an opt-in, type of process.
Right. Now that's a great distinction, and worth pointing out. But yeah, I could see that it would be so beneficial in all of these communities and in the workplace as well, because I think intuitively, most of us, if not all of us, have known that we can't just completely separate personal and professional, right? Like we are human beings. We're not AI. When we come to work, we're coming to work as a person, and we can try to compartmentalize, but it's not going to truly work. And I think if nothing else, COVID has really shown that that overlap is real, and it's very enmeshed, and allowing people to have that space to talk about how what's going on in the world really does affect you as a person, and having the allowance and the space to process that in your work environment, I think would be really beneficial for people to be able to process that. Because we're so often just like, oh, you leave home at home, this is work, and that's not truly realistic.
And especially now when home is work.
Exactly. Yep. Exactly right. Yeah. Yep.
Very different. So even on our website, there's a tab that says IIRP News, and my colleague and I, who ran the pre and post election, we did a short video just kind of explaining what we did and gave the outline. So that's just another example of, again, in a workplace, it wasn't about who are you voting for and why, that was never part of it. It was just, how do we all come together with different views and create a healthy work environment?
Right.
And just to be able to hear one another.
Yeah. Yeah. That's amazing, because as you try, one of the things that I talk about a lot and work with leaders a lot on is workplace culture and having the space for open dialogue. And I know that, again, here with the listening circle, it's not necessarily like a shared dialogue in that sense, but if you are in this hosting a space where people can share their perspective, I would think that then that would lead to, without having researched it, a natural progression of feeling more comfortable with dialogue and other times and spaces within that workplace culture that would help bridge that.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And, this is a little off topic, but also on our website, there's a tab around presidential paper series. And our vice president for administration, she has the latest one out, and it's all about workplace application of restorative practices. It's called Sparking Creativity, Workplace Applications of Restorative Practices. So, she goes a lot deeper into that culture piece at any workplace, really, what it could look like. And circles are a part of that, this is one piece of that, but it's certainly a broader conversation than one practice.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point. I'll make sure I'll link to that as well in the video description, to the overall website, but also to that paper, because
I think that paper, especially because you're talking to so many leaders, I think would be really helpful.
Yeah. So we're still have a little bit of time, but we're getting close to our time. So I always like to ask, what are some of the key don'ts and do's? What recommendations do you have for people for effective listening?
Yeah, well, I think the first one is to get yourself ready to listen, right? I think that's another thing that's really important, whether it's through this process or just engaging in any conversation. I mean, I had some colleagues who said, I'm not prepared to facilitate a listening circle around church sex abuse. I don't have the capacity for it.
Right.
Sign me up for something else. Or I don't have the capacity to do this election one, but sign me up for this one, right? So I think first and foremost, know your capacity, know what you can bring to the table. It's exhausting, right? It can be.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. But I think just in general, as far as listening goes, it is just, I would say, a do for me, or the one thing that I've really tried to do, especially over this last year with so many different divergent opinions coming out, is what are my barriers? What are the things that get in the way of me hearing a different perspective? I don't have to agree with it, right? I don't have to subscribe to it. But what are some of the barriers that get in my way? And just raising my awareness to that. I think that's certainly been helpful. I would say don't have a lot of expectations either. Just kind of like allow it to flow. I've tried to not, have too many expectations, or like that it has to be like this. This is what the outcome, must be. I think it's going to be pretty organic, depending on your group. And I, at this point, now done more online, of course, than in person. But from high school age through college, through, workplace, we've certainly had a lot of test runs over the last year in a lot of different places,
right?
Which has been, I think, really helpful.
Yeah. I love that you said about being honest about having the capacity and being, and I can see that would definitely translate to broader listening skills and being present for people. I think it's in her book, We Need to Talk. Celeste Headley talks about that, about being present for conversation. And if you can't be, to be honest about that, it's being more in the more traditional leadership workplace environment. If you really need to be focused on something and somebody knocks on your door, being respectful, but saying, I really can't give you the attention you deserve at this point in time. Like, I can't be fully present for you. Can you come back in 10 minutes or 15 minutes or whatever, and be honest, and whatever you're doing, be fully present with that thing. And if that needs to be listening, be fully present. And so whether it's having the capacity to give somebody your attention, or having the capacity and the emotional bandwidth to really facilitate a discussion about something that's maybe triggering for you. That's a fantastic point. I love that you shared that.
Yeah. And we do talk about it in the training as well. Like, we kind of go through these 3 levels of preparation, like as the lead facilitators, how are you preparing yourself, and your small group facilitators, how are you preparing? And then how are you helping to prepare participants?
Right.
That there is that question around capacity. And what do you have the capacity to hold space for?
Right. Yeah, that's great. I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any other key don'ts and do's? I know I kind of jumped in there.
No,
If not,
no, that's fine. I think those are I think that's really what sticks out to me the most, right? Is just that self-awareness piece, kind of coming into it with knowing what your capacity is, and keeping an open mind.
yeah. Oh, that's great. Yeah, the open mind, that's key. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, not projecting like you said, with the expectations and not projecting your agenda or expectations, but just having that open mind.
Yep.
Yeah, that's great.
Cool.
So, we've mentioned the website,
Mhm.
and so if they're interested in like training or just information, should they go to the website? Is that the best place to?
The website is the best place for sure. And there's a continuing education tab that has all the non-credit offerings, a graduate education tab, which is the credit offerings. And then under the restorative practices tab is that presidential paper I was talking about, and IIRP news. So
Great.
those would be and my information is also on the website under the About Us. So if anyone has direct questions, they can, certainly email me.
Awesome. Yeah, and I'll make sure all those links are included in the video description. Is
Excellent.
there anything else that you'd like to share? Any last
No,
thought?
I don't think so. I mean, again, I thank you so much for having me. This is always, something I love to talk about. But I think if we can just talk less, listen more,
Yeah.
sometimes, especially around some of the issues that we talked about today. This is just it's an opportunity in our world right now to really learn and listen, and be quiet a little bit.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Wow. Those are good parting words. That's
Yeah,
perfect. Yeah, I love it. Well,
excellent.
thank you so much, Beth. This really was such a
Oh,
treat. And I really enjoyed this time together. So thank you so much.
awesome. Thank you.
All right. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and make sure you check out the IIRP website and Beth's information, and check us out again next time.
Awesome. Bye bye.